The holiday season is often a time for joy and togetherness, but for some, it's a season that brings back memories of what was lost. For Rachel Adams, a resilient single mother doing her best to give her son, Tommy, a happy life, Christmas is bittersweet. Despite the hardships she's faced, she's built a world filled with warmth and love. But this Christmas Eve, everything changes with a knock on the door. Enter Nathaniel Blake, a man who once walked away from love in pursuit of success. When a chance encounter with a young boy claiming he abandoned them forces Nathaniel to confront the ghosts of his past, he's pulled back into a life he thought he'd left behind. But can someone who once chose ambition over family prove they've changed? And will Rachel be willing to open her heart again after so much time and pain? Chicago's streets bustled with life as the final hours of Christmas Eve ticked by. The city glowed under a canopy of twinkling lights strung between lampposts, and storefronts showcased lavish holiday displays. The snow fell softly, blanketing the sidewalks in a thin sheet of white. Despite the festive cheer in the air, Nathaniel Blake felt isolated in his own world. Nathaniel stepped out of the towering glass building that housed Blake Industries. His breath clouded in the frigid air as he pulled his coat tighter. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from the emptiness that had become familiar. The city's hum faded as he took out his phone and scrolled through a list of unread emails. Even on Christmas Eve, his work demanded his full attention. His driver was late. He checked his watch with a sigh of frustration. Nathaniel despised waiting. Everything in his life ran on a tight schedule. Efficiency, control, and precision were his guiding principles. But tonight, nothing seemed to go as planned. As he leaned against the street lamp, absorbed in an email, a small voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, mister." Nathaniel looked up, startled. Standing before him was a boy, no older than 7 or 8. His coat was several sizes too big, hanging awkwardly around his thin frame. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his knit hat was slightly askew over his messy brown curls. Nathaniel straightened, his gaze hardening. He had no time for distractions. "Yes? What do you want?" The boy didn't flinch. His wide brown eyes locked onto Nathaniel's face. "Are you Nathaniel Blake?" Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "I am. Who are you?" The boy took a step closer. His small hands were stuffed deep into his coat pockets. "My name is Tommy. My mom said you left us." For a moment, the world around Nathaniel seemed to fall silent. He stared at the boy, confused. "Excuse me?" Tommy's chin jutted out, his voice steady despite the tremor in his breath. "She told me your name. She said you left before I was born." Nathaniel's heart thudded in his chest. He glanced up and down the street, half expecting someone to appear and explain this misunderstanding. But there was no one, just Tommy, waiting for answers. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "I think you have me confused with someone else. I don't know your mother." Tommy's brow knitted. "Her name is Rachel Adams." The name hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. Memories of college days, late-night conversations, and dreams shared in quiet corners flooded his mind. Rachel's laughter, her unwavering belief in him, it all felt like a lifetime ago. He had buried those memories beneath layers of ambition and success. Nathaniel forced himself to focus. "Where is your mother now?" Tommy pointed down the block toward a small diner with a flickering neon sign. "She's working the night shift." Nathaniel followed the boy's gaze. The modest diner looked out of place against the gleaming high-rises. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, offering only blurred glimpses of patrons at the booths. "You should go back inside," Nathaniel said, his voice softer. "It's too cold for you to be out here alone." Tommy's shoulders slumped. "Okay," he mumbled, turning back toward the diner. Nathaniel watched the boy walk away, his oversized boots crunching in the snow. A knot formed in Nathaniel's chest. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that the boy must be mistaken. But as he stood there in the cold, The boy's words echoed in his mind. "She said you left before I was born." The sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and the driver hurried out to open the door. Nathaniel slid into the back seat without a word. As they drove through the snowy streets, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. But Nathaniel's mind was elsewhere. He remembered the cramped apartment where he had grown up, his mother working double shifts to keep the heat on. His father's absence had left a void he had spent his entire life trying to fill. Nathaniel had promised himself he would never look back. And yet, the past had a way of finding you, even in the heart of a bustling city. By the time the car reached his penthouse, the silence in the back seat felt suffocating. Nathaniel stared out at the glistening skyline, a hollow ache spreading in his chest. He loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass. As he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, he thought of Rachel, her wide smile, and the way she had believed in him when no one else did. They had been inseparable once, two dreamers with empty wallets and endless ambition. But ambition had a price, and Nathaniel had paid it in full. He closed his eyes, willing the memories to fade. He had worked too hard to build a life free of vulnerability. But now, that life felt empty. His phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up and scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name he hadn't seen in years. Rachel Adams. His thumb hovered over the call button before he let out a sharp breath and set the phone down. It was too late for apologies. Too late to rewrite the past. And yet, as the snow continued to fall outside, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The boy's face, earnest and full of hope, stayed with him like a lingering melody he couldn't place. He downed the rest of his drink and sank into the leather armchair, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on him. The city outside sparkled with promise, but Nathaniel's thoughts remained on the boy who had dared to confront him. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Blake felt something more than ambition. He felt the faint, fragile stirrings of regret and something else, the quiet whisper of a second chance. The morning light seeped through the towering windows of Nathaniel's penthouse, painting the polished floors in hues of pale gold. The quiet hum of the city below was muffled by the thick glass, but Nathaniel barely noticed. He had spent the night restless, haunted by thoughts of Tommy and the name that had shattered his carefully constructed composure. Rachel Adams. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen island, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He hadn't slept. Instead, memories had kept him captive, the kind he had long buried beneath years of business deals, board meetings, and expansion plans. Rachel. They had met in their sophomore year of college. She had been studying literature, with dreams of becoming a writer. He had been consumed with building his future. Rachel had been a firecracker, fierce and determined, with a contagious laugh that could fill a room. Nathaniel could still picture her sitting cross-legged on the campus lawn, her hair catching the afternoon sun as she scribbled in her worn notebook. She had believed in him when no one else had. "You're going to change the world, Nate," she would whisper, her hand in his as they dreamed of the future. "I can feel it." But changing the world had come at a cost. The day he had been offered his first big job, the opportunity to move to New York and build the life he had always dreamed of, Rachel had sat across from him at their favorite coffee shop, tracing slow circles over his knuckles, the way she always did when she was nervous. "We'll figure it out together," she had said, her voice soft and full of hope. But he had pulled his hand away. "I'm going alone, Rachel." The words had tasted bitter even then. He had convinced himself it was for the best for both of them. Attachment was a liability, and he had told himself that Rachel deserved better than a man who would sacrifice everything for success. He hadn't stayed long enough to see the pain in her eyes harden into resolve. Now, all these years later, her name had returned like a ghost. Nathaniel stood abruptly, the stool scraping against the marble floor. He couldn't sit with the memories any longer. He needed answers. An hour later, Nathaniel found himself outside the small diner Tommy had pointed to the night before. The morning rush had begun, and the diner was alive with the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the window, its letters flickering against the gray sky. Nathaniel hesitated, his heart pounding in a way that felt unfamiliar. The man who could command boardrooms with a single glance was now frozen outside a modest diner, unsure of his place. Finally, he pushed the door open. The bell above chimed softly, and warmth enveloped him as the scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. Rachel stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with practiced ease. She wore a simple blue uniform, her hair tied back in a loose bun. Despite the years that had passed, Nathaniel recognized her immediately. She looked older, her face lined with traces of time and hardship, but her presence was unmistakable. She glanced up and froze. "Nathaniel?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the noise like a blade. The rag in her hand stilled. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "Hello, Rachel?" For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rest of the diner faded into the background, the customers sipping their coffee, the waitress taking orders, the hum of conversation. All Nathaniel could see was her. "What are you doing here?" Rachel asked, her tone guarded but not unkind. Nathaniel hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He had played this moment out in his head a dozen times on the way here, but the words felt clumsy now. I saw your son," he said finally. Rachel's eyes widened, and she set the rag down on the counter. "Tommy?" Nathaniel nodded. "He approached me outside my office last night. He told me that I left you both." Rachel's jaw tightened, and she looked away for a moment, as if steadying herself. When she met his gaze again, her eyes were unreadable. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Nathaniel said quietly. "That I didn't know him. That I didn't know you had a son." Rachel exhaled slowly. "That is the truth. Tommy isn't yours, Nathaniel." Nathaniel felt the tension in his chest loosen just slightly, but the relief was short-lived, replaced by confusion. "Then why would he think that I am?" Rachel rubbed her hands together, her fingers trembling slightly. "When Tommy was little, he used to ask me why he didn't have a dad like the other kids. I didn't know how to explain it to him, not in a way that wouldn't break his heart. So, I told him stories about you, about the man I thought you were before you left." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she pressed on. "I never thought he'd believe they were real. I never thought he'd see you in the flesh." Nathaniel stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "Rachel, I never meant to. Don't." Her tone was sharp, but not angry. It was weary. "You made your choice, Nathaniel, and I made mine." The space between them felt vast. Nathaniel wanted to say something, anything to bridge the gap, but the years of distance, the unspoken pain, felt insurmountable. "I didn't come here to dredge up the past," he said finally. "I came because I don't know. Because Tommy deserves the truth." Rachel's expression softened, though her eyes remained wary. "The truth is, Tommy's been through enough. He's a good kid, Nathaniel. He doesn't need more confusion." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I understand, but if there's anything I can do to help—" Rachel hesitated, then let out a sigh. "We don't need your money or your guilt. We're doing just fine." Nathaniel reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. He set it on the counter and slid it toward her. "If you ever change your mind, I'm here." Rachel stared at the card but didn't pick it up. "You always did know how to make an exit, didn't you?" she murmured. Nathaniel managed a small, rueful smile. "I'm not trying to make an exit this time." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped back into the cold. The wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it. As he walked down the snow-dusted street, he realized that he wasn't sure where he was headed. But for the first time in years, Nathaniel Blake wasn't running from something, he was running toward it. The cold wind whipped against Nathaniel's face as he walked aimlessly down the snowy street. His mind churned with everything Rachel had said, and with the memories he had spent years trying to forget. The bell above the diner door, her voice trembling as she spoke of the stories she told Tommy. It all echoed in his mind. By the time he reached his penthouse, the ache in his chest was unbearable. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the pristine marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Chicago skyline. The city glittered below, but it felt distant, cold. Nathaniel tossed his coat over the back of the couch and sat down heavily. His penthouse, once a symbol of everything he had achieved, felt sterile. There was no laughter here, no warmth. The silence pressed in, filling the space like an unwelcome guest. Rachel's words played over in his mind. I told him stories about the man I thought you were. He had spent so long convincing himself that his ambition justified every sacrifice. And yet, somewhere out there, a little boy believed in the idea of him, a version of Nathaniel Blake who had stayed, who had cared. Nathaniel stood abruptly and walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. He stared at the city below, lost in thought. What had his success truly cost him? The deals, the promotions, the accolades, they had come at the expense of something far more valuable. He thought of Rachel's tired eyes, of Tommy's hopeful face. They had built a life without him. But was it too late to do something, to be something more than a ghost from their past? Nathaniel turned away from the window and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over Rachel's name again. The temptation to call her was almost overwhelming. But what would he say? Hey, Rachel, I want to make things right. The words felt hollow, even in his mind. There was no undoing the past. Still, the idea of doing nothing felt worse. He opened his contact list and dialed his assistant, Evelyn. She picked up after the second ring. Mr. Blake? Her voice was sharp and efficient, even this late. Evelyn, I need you to arrange something for me, Nathaniel said. Of course, sir. What do you need? Nathaniel exhaled slowly. It's personal. No press, no credit. Just make sure it happens quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end before Evelyn replied, Understood. Nathaniel outlined the details in a calm, steady voice, though his heart was anything but calm. When he ended the call, he sank into the armchair by the fireplace. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly earnings or strategic expansions. He was thinking about how fragile life could be and how easy it was to take for granted the things that mattered most. The next morning, Rachel woke early, as she always did. The apartment was small but tidy. Tommy's crayon drawings covered the fridge, taped haphazardly over coupons and reminders. A toy truck lay on the worn carpet near the couch. It wasn't much, but it was home. She padded into the kitchen, her socks silent against the cold floor. She opened the cabinet, frowning at the nearly empty box of cereal. The paycheck from the diner would arrive next week, but Christmas had stretched her thin. Rachel glanced toward Tommy's bedroom, where he was still sleeping. His small frame was bundled under a quilt, his curls peeking out from the top. She smiled softly before returning to the kitchen, determined to make the best of what they had. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. She frowned at the unknown number before answering. Hello? Miss Adams? The voice was polite but formal. We're calling to inform you that the balance on your utility bill has been paid in full. Rachel blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. What? The balance has been cleared, the voice repeated. No further payments are due this month. Rachel's hand tightened around the phone. There must be some mistake. No mistake, ma'am. Happy holidays. The line disconnected, leaving Rachel standing in stunned silence. She stared at her reflection in the microwave door, trying to process what had just happened. Later that day, when she returned from her shift at the diner, she noticed something else. The leak in the kitchen sink had been repaired. She bent down, inspecting the previously dripping faucet, which was now fixed. Her heart fluttered with a strange mix of gratitude and suspicion. Small miracles didn't just happen. Someone was behind this, and she had a feeling she knew who. That evening, Nathaniel sat in his office at Blake Industries, staring at the clock. He should have felt satisfaction in knowing that Rachel and Tommy's situation was improving, but instead, there was a gnawing emptiness inside him. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn stepped inside, holding a small envelope. "The repairs were taken care of, as requested," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "Thank you, Evelyn." She hesitated, then added, "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, this seems unlike you." Nathaniel looked at her, his expression softening. "It is." He paused, then said, "People can change, Evelyn." Evelyn nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind her. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to this, to feeling unsure, to taking steps with no clear outcome. But as he pictured Tommy's small hands gripping the hem of his too-big coat, he knew he couldn't stop now. The next morning, Rachel opened the door to find a large package sitting on the stoop. Tommy squealed with excitement as they brought it inside. He tore at the wrapping paper, revealing a box filled with winter clothes, books, and a new pair of boots that fit him perfectly. At the bottom of the box was an envelope. Rachel hesitated before opening it. Inside was a simple note. "Merry Christmas to you and Tommy. I hope this makes things a little easier." There was no signature, but Rachel didn't need one. She sank into the chair at the table, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't know how to feel: grateful, angry, or both. Tommy was already running in circles with his new boots, laughing with pure joy. Rachel wiped at her eyes, trying to clear the blur of tears. Whatever Nathaniel's reasons, his kindness had brought warmth into their small home. And as Rachel watched her son's laughter fill the room, she couldn't deny that something had shifted. Perhaps not all stories ended the way you expected. Some changed with time. Some, just maybe, could begin again. The morning air was crisp and bright as sunlight poured through the frost-covered windows of Rachel's small apartment. Tommy sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by his new books and toys. His cheeks were flushed with excitement as he lined up his new toy cars in neat rows, humming to himself. Rachel watched from the kitchen, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The box of gifts had brought so much joy to Tommy, but for her, it had only raised more questions. She couldn't shake the thought of Nathaniel's quiet involvement. She knew it was him. Who else would have done something like this? Her gaze drifted to the small envelope sitting on the kitchen table, the simple note folded neatly inside. The words weren't flowery or sentimental, but they felt sincere. She sipped her coffee and closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment to process everything. For years, she had convinced herself that she didn't need Nathaniel's help, that she and Tommy could get by just fine. But now, his unexpected kindness had chipped away at her carefully built walls, leaving her unsure of what to feel. She thought of the past, the rainy afternoon at the cafe, the moment Nathaniel had pulled his hand away, the hurt that had settled in her chest like a stone. She had picked up the pieces after he left, built a life for herself and Tommy. And yet, after all this time, Nathaniel was here again, not in person, but in action. Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, look!" She smiled as he held up a picture he had drawn, a bright scene of snowmen, stars, and presents under a tree. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Rachel said, walking over and kneeling beside him. "You're getting better every day." Tommy beamed. "Do you think Santa's the one who sent the presents?" Rachel hesitated, brushing her hand gently over his curls. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe someone who wanted to make sure you had a happy Christmas." Tommy's face lit up, as if the thought itself was magic. "Whoever it was, they're really nice." Rachel nodded but didn't respond. Instead, she wondered how long she could shield her son from the truth, or if she even should. That afternoon, while Tommy napped in his room, Rachel found herself pacing the living room. The apartment felt too quiet, the questions in her mind too loud. Before she could stop herself, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Nathaniel's contact for a long moment. What would she say? What could she say? Taking a deep breath, she tapped the screen and raised the phone to her ear. It rang twice before she heard his familiar voice. Rachel? Nathaniel sounded surprised and cautious. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. Hi, Nathaniel. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I know what you did. The bills, the repairs, the gifts. That was you, wasn't it? There was a beat of silence before Nathaniel answered. Yes, it was. Rachel closed her eyes. She had known the answer, but hearing him admit it sent a wave of emotions crashing over her: gratitude, frustration, and something else she couldn't quite name. Why? She asked, her voice quieter now. Nathaniel exhaled on the other end of the line. Because I wanted to help. I know I can't change the past, Rachel, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Rachel pressed a hand to her forehead, fighting the sting of tears. I didn't ask for this, Nathaniel. I know, he said gently, but I wanted to show you that I care, even if you don't want to see me again, even if you never forgive me. I wanted to make things a little easier for you and Tommy. Rachel felt the ache in his voice, the vulnerability he rarely showed. She sank into the couch, her hand trembling slightly. You can't just swoop in with money and fix things, she said. Life doesn't work like that. I know that, Nathaniel replied. But I'm not trying to buy forgiveness. I just want to be someone Tommy can count on. And maybe someone you can count on too. Rachel let out a slow breath, the weight of his words pressing against her heart. I don't know if I can trust you, Nathaniel, she whispered. Not after everything. There was another pause before Nathaniel spoke again, his voice steady but soft. You don't have to trust me right away. I'll earn it, Rachel, if you let me. Rachel's eyes drifted to Tommy's door, where her son slept peacefully, unaware of the complicated web of emotions surrounding him. Tommy doesn't need more confusion, she said, almost to herself. I understand, Nathaniel said, but I'm not going anywhere this time. Rachel wiped at her eyes, the warmth of his promise settling deep in her chest. We'll see, she murmured, her voice barely audible. We'll see. The next morning, Rachel bundled Tommy in his new coat and boots. They stepped outside into the fresh blanket of snow, Tommy's laughter echoing through the still street as he stomped footprints into the powder. Rachel watched him with a soft smile, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a snowflake resting on her palm, but it was there. As they reached the corner, Rachel noticed a familiar figure standing near the diner. Nathaniel's hands were stuffed into the pockets of his wool coat, his breath visible in the cold air. Tommy's eyes widened. Mom, it's him! Rachel's heart skipped a beat as Nathaniel approached, his expression uncertain but sincere. Good morning, he said, his gaze flickering to Tommy before settling on Rachel. Tommy grinned. Are you the one who sent the presents? Nathaniel knelt to Tommy's level, his smile soft but genuine. What do you think? Tommy's grin widened. I think you did. Nathaniel laughed quietly. You might be right. Rachel watched the exchange, her chest tightening with emotion. Seeing them together felt surreal, like watching two worlds slowly merge. Nathaniel stood and looked at Rachel. Can we talk? Rachel hesitated, then nodded. All right. As Tommy ran ahead, kicking up snow with each step, Nathaniel and Rachel walked side by side. The silence between them was no longer heavy with resentment. It was filled with something unspoken, something fragile, but real. The diner was quieter than usual when Rachel and Nathaniel sat down at a corner booth. The hum of the coffee machine and the soft clinking of silverware filled the space, but it all seemed distant. Tommy had settled into a nearby seat with his new book, engrossed in the colorful pages, his feet swinging beneath the table. Rachel kept her eyes on her son, as if grounding herself in his innocence would make this conversation easier. She folded her hands on the table, her fingers interlaced tightly. Across from her, Nathaniel sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, not out of defeat, but out of an unfamiliar vulnerability. "You really didn't have to follow us here," Rachel said finally, her tone steady but guarded. Nathaniel offered a faint smile. "I didn't come to intrude. I just wanted a chance to explain." Rachel met his gaze, searching his face for the man she used to know. His eyes were the same sharp blue, but they held a softness, now a weight that hadn't been there before. "You've already done enough," Rachel said, though there was no bitterness in her voice. "The gifts, the repairs, the bills." She paused, her throat tightening. "Why, Nathaniel? Why now?" Nathaniel exhaled slowly, resting his hands flat on the table. "Because I didn't realize until I saw Tommy how much I walked away from. I thought I was making the right choice back then. I told myself I was building a life worth having, but sitting in that penthouse, surrounded by everything I ever worked for, it feels empty." Rachel's brow furrowed, her grip on her own hands tightening. "You think fixing a few things will make up for what you did?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No, I know it won't. I'm not here to fix the past, Rachel. I'm here because I want to be here for you and for Tommy. However you'll let me." Rachel leaned back slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can't just step into his life and leave again when things get hard." "I won't." Nathaniel's voice was quiet but firm. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm willing to earn it. I'm willing to stay." Rachel's eyes softened, though doubt still lingered beneath the surface. She looked at Tommy, who was now flipping through another page, oblivious to the storm of emotions unfolding at the table. "I don't want him getting hurt," she whispered. "I don't either," Nathaniel said, his gaze following hers. "I promise you, Rachel, I'm not going anywhere this time." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, trying to silence the part of her heart that still remembered how much it hurt to watch him walk away all those years ago. She wasn't sure she could believe him, not yet, but something in the quiet conviction of his voice made her want to try. Later that afternoon, Rachel and Tommy returned home. The sky had turned gray, and snowflakes drifted lazily through the air as they climbed the steps to their apartment. Rachel was about to unlock the door when Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, do you think Mr. Nathaniel is a good guy?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide and thoughtful. Rachel knelt down to his level and brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "What do you think?" Tommy tilted his head, considering. "I think he's trying really hard to be. But if he's like the hero in my books, he has to prove it." Rachel smiled, despite herself. "You're right. Sometimes people need time to prove who they really are." Tommy nodded solemnly, satisfied with her answer, and bounded inside. The apartment was filled with warmth from the heater that had finally been fixed. Rachel's eyes swept over the small living room, the worn couch, the stack of secondhand books on the coffee table, the crayon drawings still taped to the walls. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. She set Tommy's backpack by the door and sat down on the couch. The envelope with Nathaniel's note was still resting on the table, and she picked it up again, reading the words as if they would change. But they didn't. The next few days passed quietly. Nathaniel didn't call or show up unannounced. It was as if he had listened, had heard her hesitation, and chosen to give her space. But his presence was felt in other ways. One evening, Rachel opened the front door to find a grocery bag sitting on the stoop. Inside were fresh fruits, vegetables, and staples. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bought things like real butter, fresh eggs, and a small tin of cocoa powder. There was no note, but she didn't need one. Rachel stared at the bag for a long moment before carrying it inside. Tommy cheered when he saw the cocoa and begged for hot chocolate. Rachel relented, heating the milk on the stove and stirring in the cocoa. When she handed Tommy his mug, he smiled so wide it made her heart ache. "This is the best hot chocolate ever," he declared, his cheeks flushed from the warmth. Rachel sat across from him, her own mug cradled in her hands. "I'm glad you like it, sweetheart." Tommy took another sip and sighed contentedly. "Do you think Mr. Nathaniel likes hot chocolate?" Rachel's fingers tightened around the mug. "I think he might," she said softly. Tommy grinned. "Maybe we should make some for him one day." Rachel's heart twisted at the innocent suggestion. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply reached over and ruffled Tommy's hair. "Maybe," she murmured. The next morning, as Rachel walked Tommy to school, she noticed the snow had been shoveled from their building's steps and sidewalk. She hadn't seen anyone doing it, but the work had been done with care. She found herself looking down the street as if expecting to catch a glimpse of Nathaniel, but the road was empty. She let out a slow breath, unsure whether to feel comforted or unnerved. Nathaniel was trying. She couldn't deny that. And even though she wasn't sure where it would all lead, she couldn't ignore the quiet way he was starting to make a difference in their lives. As she watched Tommy skip ahead, his laughter ringing out against the cold morning air, Rachel felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, but welcome a small, cautious hope. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned quiet and gray, the city blanketed in fresh snow. Rachel woke to the sound of Tommy's soft breathing from his room. She stretched and yawned, but something felt off. The apartment was unusually still, almost too still. She padded to Tommy's room and peeked inside. He was curled up under his quilt, his face flushed and his curls damp with sweat. Rachel's heart sank as she moved closer and placed a hand on his forehead. It was burning hot. "Tommy?" she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. Tommy stirred, blinking up at her with glassy eyes. "I'm tired, Mom," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's pulse quickened. She grabbed the thermometer from the bathroom and slid it under his tongue. The numbers flashed a moment later, 103 degrees. A fever this high wasn't normal. Panic surged in her chest. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice calm, even though her hands trembled. "We're going to get you feeling better." Rachel hurried to her phone and called her neighbor, Mrs. Jacobs, who sometimes helped when things got tough. The line rang, then went to voicemail. She tried the diner, hoping one of her co-workers might be able to give her a ride to the hospital, but no one picked up. She glanced outside. The snowstorm that had been light in the morning was now heavy, the streets coated in a thick layer of white. There was no way she could walk to the clinic, and she didn't own a car. Rachel sat down at the kitchen table, pressing her hands to her forehead. She felt trapped. She needed help. Her eyes drifted to the card sitting by the sink, the one with Nathaniel's number. She had told herself she wouldn't call him unless it was a last resort. But now, with Tommy lying in bed sick, there was no room for pride. She reached for the card, her fingers hesitant for only a second before she pressed the number. Nathaniel answered on the second ring. "Rachel." His voice was steady but cautious, and hearing it made something in her chest tighten. "It's Tommy," she said quickly. "He's sick, and I can't get him to the hospital because of the storm." There was a brief pause. Then Nathaniel's voice came back calm but resolute. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." Before Rachel could respond, he had already hung up. The minutes dragged by like hours as Rachel sat by Tommy's bedside, stroking his hair and whispering reassurances. She listened for the sound of footsteps outside and tried not to panic. When she finally heard the knock on the door, she jumped up and ran to open it. Nathaniel stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, his breath fogging the air as snowflakes clung to his dark hair. Without a word, Nathaniel stepped inside and took in the scene, the small apartment, the narrow hallway, and the worried look in Rachel's eyes. "Where is he?" Nathaniel asked. Rachel motioned to Tommy's room, and Nathaniel followed her in. Tommy lay still under his blanket, his cheeks flushed with fever. Nathaniel knelt beside the bed and gently placed a hand on Tommy's forehead, his expression tightening. He turned back to Rachel. "We need to get him to the hospital now." Rachel nodded and grabbed a small bag with Tommy's essentials. Nathaniel slipped his arms under Tommy and lifted him carefully, holding the boy as if he were the most fragile thing in the world. Tommy barely stirred. They stepped out into the storm, the wind biting at their faces as they made their way to Nathaniel's waiting SUV. The driver had kept the car running, and the heat blasted warmth into the cabin as Nathaniel climbed in with Tommy, still cradled in his arms. Rachel slid in beside them and pulled the door shut. "Please, hurry," she said, her voice trembling. The driver nodded and pulled onto the icy street. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Snow piled high on the roads, and visibility was poor. The SUV skidded slightly around one turn, but the driver kept the vehicle steady. Rachel couldn't stop watching Tommy's face, her heart squeezing tighter with every shallow breath he took. Nathaniel shifted slightly, adjusting his hold on Tommy and murmuring softly, "You're going to be okay, buddy. We've got you." Rachel's eyes flickered to Nathaniel, and for the first time, she saw something raw and unguarded in him: fear. The man who had once been so composed, so sure of everything, looked as vulnerable as she felt. They reached the hospital at last, and Nathaniel didn't wait for anyone to help. He carried Tommy through the sliding glass doors, his footsteps quick and determined. A nurse rushed forward with a stretcher, guiding them to an exam room. Rachel hovered near the bed, holding Tommy's small hand as the doctor checked his vitals. Nathaniel stood at the back of the room, giving her space, but staying close enough to offer support. "It's a viral infection," the doctor explained after a thorough examination. "We'll bring his fever down with fluids and medication. He'll need rest, but he's going to be okay." Rachel let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her like a wave. She closed her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. When she opened them, Nathaniel was watching her, his expression soft and concerned. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't have to thank me. I'm glad I could help." Rachel nodded, unable to say more without her voice breaking. They stayed at the hospital until Tommy's fever finally broke. He stirred awake at one point, blinking up at Rachel with a tired but peaceful smile. "Hey, sweetheart," Rachel murmured, brushing his curls back. Tommy's gaze drifted to Nathaniel, who had pulled up a chair near the bed. "Mr. Nathaniel?" he asked, his voice still weak but full of wonder. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Yeah, buddy, I'm here." "You saved us," Tommy said with a small smile. Nathaniel's throat tightened, and he gave the boy's hand a gentle squeeze. "You're the brave one, Tommy." Tommy's eyelids drooped again, and soon he was sound asleep, his breathing steady. Rachel sat quietly, watching her son rest. The fear that had gripped her heart was finally loosening, replaced by gratitude and something unexpected: comfort. Nathaniel shifted beside her, and she looked over at him. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy with pain. It felt like something new. As they watched Tommy sleep, the snowstorm outside began to calm, and a soft dawn light broke over the horizon. The sun had risen by the time the hospital discharged Tommy. A soft golden light filtered through the windows, making the world outside seem peaceful in contrast to the fear that had gripped Rachel's heart the night before. Tommy was bundled up in a blanket as Nathaniel carried him out to the SUV. The little boy had fallen back asleep, his face finally free of fever's flush. Rachel followed close behind, her steps slow with exhaustion, but steady with relief. As they drove back to the apartment, the streets were quiet, the city still waking under its blanket of fresh snow. When they reached the apartment, Nathaniel carefully carried Tommy inside and tucked him into his small bed. Tommy stirred only slightly, his hand curling around his quilt. Rachel pulled the blanket higher around him and leaned down to kiss his forehead. His skin was cool to the touch finally. Nathaniel stepped back, watching the scene with a quiet reverence. When Rachel straightened, she hesitated before looking at him. "You should sit down," she said, her voice soft. Nathaniel glanced at the worn couch and nodded, removing his coat and draping it over the armrest before lowering himself into the seat. Rachel busied herself in the kitchen for a few minutes, mostly to give herself something to do. She made tea, nothing fancy, just 2 mugs of hot water and a tea bag in each. When she brought the mugs over, Nathaniel accepted his with a grateful nod. "Thanks," he said, wrapping his hands around the warmth. Rachel settled into the armchair across from him, her own mug untouched in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint sound of Tommy's breathing from the other room. "You didn't have to stay," Rachel said at last, her eyes searching Nathaniel's face. "I wanted to," Nathaniel replied, his voice calm but earnest. "I didn't want you to go through that alone." Rachel's gaze dropped to her tea. "I've been doing it alone for a long time." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry." Rachel let out a slow breath and looked back at him. There was no anger in her eyes now, only a tired honesty. "Why, Nathaniel? Why now?" Nathaniel took a sip of tea, letting the warmth steady him before he spoke. "Because seeing you and Tommy made me realize how much I've missed, how much I've avoided. I thought I was doing what was best back then, for both of us. I was afraid of failing, of being anything less than perfect. And instead, I became exactly what I never wanted to be." Rachel's eyes softened as she listened, but there was still a guardedness in her expression. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not here to pretend I can undo the past. I'm here because I want to be better, because I want to be part of Tommy's life, if you'll let me." Rachel didn't answer right away. She felt the weight of his words settle over her. The man who had walked out all those years ago wasn't the same one sitting in front of her now. There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to gloss over the pain he had caused. He wasn't asking for instant forgiveness, he was asking for a chance. "Tommy doesn't know the full truth," she said quietly, "about his real father. He thinks you're the hero from the stories I told him." Nathaniel's heart sank as he absorbed her words. "Rachel." She shook her head. "I never told him those things to hurt him. I told him because I wanted him to believe in something good." Nathaniel's voice softened. "And now?" Rachel's gaze drifted to the bedroom door, where Tommy lay peacefully sleeping. "Now I don't know what to believe." She met Nathaniel's eyes, her own filled with unshed tears. "He's already lost so much. I'm terrified that if I let you in, he'll lose you too." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He set his tea down and leaned forward even more. "I won't walk away again. I swear it." Rachel bit her lip, weighing his words. The memory of that rainy day in the cafe still haunted her. But as she sat across from Nathaniel now, she could see that the man in front of her was really trying to make things right. "He needs stability," Rachel said finally. "And so do I." Nathaniel nodded. "You both deserve that, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust. No more grand gestures, just me showing up day by day." Rachel's eyes softened. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, and something inside her began to thaw. "You're different," she said, almost to herself. Nathaniel's smile was small, but genuine. "I had to be." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air, but not suffocating. It felt lighter now, as if the walls between them had started to come down. Rachel glanced at the clock. "You've been up all night. You should get some rest." Nathaniel chuckled softly. "You too." Rachel smiled despite herself. "Yeah." She stood and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "Thank you, Nathaniel, for everything." Nathaniel stood as well, slipping into his coat. "Any time." Rachel opened the door, and the cold morning air rushed in. Nathaniel stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots. He turned back one last time. "Merry Christmas, Rachel." She gave a small nod. "Merry Christmas, Nathaniel." The apartment felt warm and still after he left. Rachel stood by the window, watching as Nathaniel's SUV disappeared down the street. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle around her. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear and weariness. Hope. In the other room, Tommy murmured softly in his sleep. Rachel walked back to his bedside and sat beside him, brushing his curls gently. He was safe. They were safe. And maybe, just maybe, they had found a way forward. The soft hum of the heater filled the apartment as Christmas Day unfolded in quiet simplicity. The storm had passed, leaving the city covered in a sparkling white blanket. The streets outside remained calm, as though the world itself had paused to rest. Tommy was still asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, stirring a cup of coffee she had barely touched. She watched the steam rise and drift away, thinking about the night before, the fear, the relief, and the unexpected comfort of Nathaniel's presence. He had been there when she needed him most. No excuses, no hesitation. For years she had carried the weight of his absence, convinced she couldn't rely on anyone but herself. Now, for the first time in a long time, she wondered if it was possible to let someone in without the fear of losing everything. The sound of soft footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Tommy padded into the kitchen, his curls tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He wore the new slippers he had unwrapped days earlier, another quiet reminder of Nathaniel's thoughtfulness. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled as he climbed onto the chair next to her. "Good morning, sweetheart," Rachel said, brushing his hair back gently. "How are you feeling?" Tommy gave a small, sleepy smile. "Better." He reached for the cup of water she had set out for him and took a sip. Then, as if remembering something important, he looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Did Mr. Nathaniel stay with us all night?" Rachel's heart clenched at the innocent question. "He did," she said softly. "He wanted to make sure you were okay." Tommy's face lit up with a bright, boyish grin. "I knew he was like the heroes in my books." Rachel couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm, but there was a bittersweet tug in her chest. "Tommy," she began, her voice cautious, "you know that real heroes are just people, right? And sometimes, people make mistakes." Tommy nodded solemnly. "But they can still be good if they try to fix things, right?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Yes, they can." Tommy seemed satisfied with her answer. He slid off his chair and ran to his small pile of new books, eager to lose himself in stories of adventure. Rachel watched him for a moment, her smile softening as she saw how quickly he had bounced back from the scare of the night before. But her mind was still on Nathaniel, on his quiet strength, his promise to stay, and the way he had looked at Tommy as if the boy was the most important thing in the world. The following week, life returned to its usual rhythm, but something had shifted. Nathaniel didn't disappear back into his world of boardrooms and business meetings. He stayed true to his word. He started small. He texted Rachel every morning to check in on Tommy. The messages were short but thoughtful updates on the weather, reminders to stay warm, and the occasional joke that made her smile despite herself. One afternoon, while Rachel was finishing her shift at the diner, she stepped outside and found Nathaniel waiting near the corner. His coat was dusted with snow, and he was holding a paper bag. "I thought I'd walk you home," he said, offering a hesitant smile. Rachel raised an eyebrow, but couldn't hide the warmth spreading through her chest. "That's a long walk for you." Nathaniel shrugged. "I figured it was worth it." He handed her the bag. "I also brought you some soup. Figured you could use something warm after work." Rachel peered inside and saw a container of steaming tomato soup, along with a small loaf of fresh bread. The simple gesture caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said quietly. As they walked through the snowy streets, the conversation between them felt easy. Nathaniel asked about her day, and she found herself answering without the usual walls she kept up. He told her a funny story about a disastrous holiday party at Blake Industries, and she laughed a genuine, unguarded laugh that felt foreign and familiar all at once. When they reached her apartment building, Nathaniel hesitated at the bottom step. "I'm not trying to push," he said, meeting her eyes. "I just want to be around. For both of you." Rachel's smile was small but real. "I know, and I appreciate it." Nathaniel's expression softened. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night, Nathaniel." She watched as he walked away, the snow crunching under his feet, until he disappeared around the corner. A few days later, Tommy came home from school holding a small, homemade card. He bounced into the apartment and handed it to Rachel with a grin. "It's for Mr. Nathaniel." Rachel took the card and ran her fingers over the crayon-drawn stars and hearts on the front. Inside, in Tommy's messy handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being there for me. You're the best." Rachel felt her eyes sting as she read the words. Tommy's innocence and hope were wrapped up in that small card, and she knew what it meant. "Do you want to give it to him yourself?" she asked gently. Tommy nodded eagerly. "Can we see him today?" Rachel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, let's go." Nathaniel was in his office when they arrived. His assistant led them inside, and Nathaniel looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before it melted into a smile. "Rachel, Tommy." He stood, stepping around the desk. "What a nice surprise." Tommy ran up to him and handed him the card, beaming. "It's for you." Nathaniel knelt down, taking the card with both hands. He read it slowly, his throat tightening. "Thank you, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot to me." Tommy threw his arms around Nathaniel in a tight hug, and Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of that small gesture sink in. Rachel watched the scene unfold, her heart full but fragile. She still wasn't sure where this road would lead, but she knew one thing: Nathaniel was trying. And for Tommy's sake, and maybe for her own, it was worth giving him the chance to prove himself. When Nathaniel stood, Rachel met his eyes and gave him a small nod of approval. "We're going to take things one step at a time," she said. Nathaniel's smile was soft but steady. "That's all I'm asking for." As they left his office together, Rachel felt something shift inside her. The fear of being let down was still there, but it was no longer the loudest voice. For the first time in years, she could feel trust rebuilding itself, slowly but surely, like a new foundation after a long winter storm. The first rays of January sunlight streamed through the windows of Rachel's apartment, casting a soft glow on the kitchen table where she sat with a mug of coffee in hand. It was early, but Tommy was already awake, bouncing in his seat as he waited for the pancakes Rachel was cooking. "Mom, do you think Mr. Nathaniel is coming today?" Tommy asked, resting his chin on his hands. Rachel smiled as she flipped the pancake in the pan, the batter sizzling. "I don't know, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" Tommy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Because I want to show him my new rocket ship drawing. He said he likes space stuff, remember?" Rachel's heart softened. Nathaniel had been keeping his promises. He had shown up every time, not just for her, but for Tommy. And the little boy, who had once only known stories of Nathaniel, was now beginning to believe in the man behind them. A soft knock at the door made Tommy spring to his feet. He raced down the hall, his slippers sliding on the floor as he flung the door open. "Mr. Nathaniel!" Nathaniel stood there, bundled in a coat and scarf, holding a small paper bag. A smile spread across his face as he saw Tommy's excitement. "Hey, buddy! Merry New Year's Eve!" Tommy giggled and ran to Rachel. "He came? He's here!" Rachel chuckled and wiped her hands on a dish towel as she walked to the door. "Good morning," she said, giving Nathaniel a curious look. "You're early." Nathaniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I figured I'd stop by before you two made any big plans, and I brought bagels." He held up the bag with a sheepish smile. "Consider it a peace offering for being unannounced." Rachel laughed and shook her head. "You didn't need to bring anything." Nathaniel shrugged. "It's the least I could do." They sat together at the kitchen table, Nathaniel spreading cream cheese on a bagel as Tommy chattered away about his rocket ship drawing and all the new facts he had learned about space. Nathaniel listened intently, asking questions that made Tommy's grin grow wider. Rachel sipped her coffee, watching the scene with quiet contentment. She had been so afraid of letting Nathaniel back into their lives, but here he was present, patient, and kind. When breakfast was finished, Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression serious but warm. "I wanted to talk to you both about something," he began, glancing between Rachel and Tommy. Rachel's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Nathaniel took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can make a real difference, not just for you two, but for other families who might be struggling. So, I've decided to step back from running Blake Industries full-time." Rachel's eyes widened. "You're stepping back?" Nathaniel nodded. "I'll still be involved, but I'm not going to let it consume my life anymore. Instead, I'm starting something new, a foundation dedicated to supporting single parents and kids who need a little extra help. And I want to name it after Tommy." Tommy's mouth dropped open. "After me?" Nathaniel smiled. "That's right, buddy. You inspired me." Tommy's face lit up as he scrambled over to hug Nathaniel tightly. "That's so cool." Nathaniel wrapped his arms around Tommy, his heart swelling at the boy's joy. He looked over Tommy's shoulder and saw Rachel's eyes glistening with emotion. When Tommy let go and went back to his drawing, Rachel leaned forward, her voice soft. "Nathaniel, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Nathaniel replied gently. "This isn't about making up for the past. It's about building something better for the future." Rachel nodded slowly, her throat tight. "I never thought I'd see this side of you again." Nathaniel's smile was small but sincere. "I never thought I'd find it again. But being here with you and Tommy reminded me of what really matters." Later that day, they bundled up and headed to the park at Tommy's request. Snow glistened on the trees, and children's laughter echoed through the frosty air. Nathaniel and Rachel sat on a bench, watching Tommy make a snowman with a group of kids. Rachel glanced sideways at Nathaniel. "You really surprised me today." Nathaniel chuckled, brushing snow off his coat. "Is that a good thing?" She smiled. "It is. I wasn't sure if you'd ever slow down, but here you are, playing hooky at the park." Nathaniel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "It feels pretty good, actually." They watched Tommy for a moment longer before Rachel spoke again, her voice quiet. "I was afraid you'd only show up for a little while, that you'd leave again when things got hard." Nathaniel's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I'm not leaving, Rachel. I've made my mistakes. I know I can't erase them, but I can make better choices now. I'm not running anymore." Rachel nodded, a small but hopeful smile forming on her lips. "I can see that." The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky as they walked back to the apartment, the air crisp and still. Tommy's cheeks were flushed from the cold, but he was beaming as he described the snowman he and his friends had built. When they reached the apartment, Nathaniel hesitated at the door. "Would you two likes to come to my place tomorrow morning? I'd love to have you over for breakfast. No strings, No expectations. Rachel glanced at Tommy, who was already nodding eagerly. She laughed softly and looked back at Nathaniel. All right. Breakfast sounds nice. Nathaniel's smile was bright and genuine. Great. The next morning, Rachel and Tommy stepped into Nathaniel's penthouse, their eyes widening at the sight of the grand room decorated with soft, twinkling lights. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments reflecting the early morning light. The dining table was set with a warm and inviting breakfast, spread pancakes, eggs, fresh fruit, and pastries. Mom, look at the tree, Tommy whispered, tugging at Rachel's hand. Nathaniel walked over, his expression hopeful but calm. I wanted it to feel special, like a new beginning. Rachel's heart felt full as she took in the effort he had made not to impress, but to welcome them into his life. They sat together, the conversation flowing easily as they shared breakfast. Tommy's laughter rang out as he told Nathaniel about his dreams of becoming an astronaut. When the meal was finished, Nathaniel led them to the couch near the tree. He leaned forward, his voice soft but steady. Rachel, I know it's going to take time, but I hope we can keep building something real together. Rachel's eyes shimmered with emotion as she nodded. We can. Tommy climbed onto the couch between them and grabbed both of their hands. This is the best Christmas ever, he declared with a wide grin. Rachel and Nathaniel exchanged a look filled with understanding and hope. It's definitely one to remember, Rachel said softly. And for the first time in years, they felt not only the weight of what had been lost, but the quiet joy of what had been found. The morning sky was a pale canvas of soft blues and golds as the first day of the new year began. The city outside Nathaniel's penthouse windows was still and peaceful, dusted with fresh snow from the night before. Inside, the warmth of laughter and the hum of conversation filled the air, wrapping around the room like an embrace. Rachel sat near the couch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, as she watched Tommy excitedly examine the new set of books Nathaniel had given him. Each cover was bright and colorful, filled with stories of adventure and discovery. Tommy's eyes sparkled as he flipped through the pages, humming with contentment. Nathaniel was seated across from her, a soft smile on his face as he watched Tommy. His posture was relaxed in a way that Rachel hadn't seen before. It was as though, after years of striving and running, he had finally found a place to rest. It's strange, Rachel said softly, breaking the quiet. Nathaniel's eyes shifted to her, curious. What is? Rachel traced the edge of her mug, her expression thoughtful. Being here, feeling I'd okay. I didn't think I'd ever trust you enough to let this happen. Nathaniel nodded, his smile fading into something more serious. I know, and I don't take it lightly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Rachel, I'm grateful you gave me this chance. I know how hard it must have been. Rachel met his gaze, her heart tight but steady. It was, but you've kept showing up, and Tommy. She glanced at her son, who was engrossed in his books. He's happier than I've seen him in a long time. And that matters more than anything. Nathaniel followed her gaze, his chest tightening as he watched Tommy. He's amazing, he said quietly. Brave, smart, kind. He gets that from you. Rachel's cheeks flushed slightly, but she smiled. He's his own little force of nature. Nathaniel chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. That he is. As the morning passed, the three of them bundled up and headed outside for a walk through the snow-covered park. The air was crisp, each breath visible in the cold. The world felt new, as if it had been scrubbed clean overnight. Tommy raced ahead, his laughter ringing out as he kicked up clouds of snow. Look, Mom, Mr. Nathaniel, I'm making a snow trail. Rachel and Nathaniel walked side by side, their footsteps crunching softly beneath them. You know, Nathaniel said after a moment, I've never really liked winter. It always felt too still. too empty. He glanced at Rachel, a soft smile tugging at his lips. But today, it feels different. Rachel looked up at the clear sky, the sunlight catching in her hair. Maybe it's not the winter that changed, she said quietly. Nathaniel's smile deepened. Maybe. They reached the center of the park, where a large hill overlooked the frozen lake. Tommy turned and waved at them, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Come on, let's slide down," Rachel laughed, shaking her head. "We didn't bring a sled, sweetheart." Tommy's face lit up with an idea. "We can use our jackets." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. "He's resourceful, I'll give him that." Rachel laughed again, a sound so light and free that it caught her off guard. For a brief moment, she let herself embrace the silliness of it all. "All right," she said, shrugging out of her coat. "Why not?" Nathaniel hesitated for a second, then grinned and pulled off his coat. "Okay, Tommy, you win." They slid down the hill one at a time, their laughter mingling with the cold wind as they raced to the bottom. When they reached the bottom of the hill, they tumbled into the snow, breathless and grinning. Rachel wiped snow from her face, her heart pounding with a kind of joy she hadn't felt in years. Nathaniel lay beside her, his dark hair dusted with snowflakes, his eyes bright with something close to wonder. Tommy flopped down between them, spreading his arms wide in the snow. "That was the best," he declared, his voice ringing with pure delight. Rachel sat up, brushing Tommy's curls back from his forehead. "You've got snow everywhere," she teased. Tommy giggled and shook his head, sending a spray of snow into the air. "I don't care." Nathaniel laughed and sat up too, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He glanced at Rachel, his expression softening. "Thank you." Rachel tilted her head, puzzled. "For what?" Nathaniel's gaze was steady, sincere. "For letting me be part of this." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She felt the truth in his words, the gratitude woven into every syllable. She reached over and placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but deliberate. "You've earned it." Nathaniel's eyes glistened, but he nodded without speaking. The moment felt fragile but strong, like the first steps on new ground after a long, uncertain journey. Later that afternoon, back at the penthouse, Tommy curled up on the couch with his new books, his face peaceful as he read. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Rachel stood by the window, watching the city come alive with lights as the new year unfolded. Nathaniel joined her, his hands resting in his pockets as he gazed out at the view. "It's beautiful," Rachel murmured. Nathaniel nodded. "It is." He hesitated before adding, "Rachel, I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to be part of it. With you, with Tommy." Rachel turned to face him, her eyes warm but serious. "It's going to take time, but I'm willing to try." Nathaniel's heart swelled with a quiet joy. "That's all I've ever wanted." They stood there in comfortable silence, the weight of the past no longer pressing down on them, but resting lightly, like a lesson learned. Behind them, Tommy looked up from his book and smiled at the sight of them standing side by side. He didn't understand everything that had happened between them, but in his heart, he felt the magic of something whole, a family, coming together. "Mom, Mr. Nathaniel, can we stay like this forever?" Tommy asked, his voice soft and hopeful. Rachel smiled and walked over to him, wrapping him in a hug. "We can try, sweetheart." Nathaniel joined them, resting a hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "We'll try together," he said, his voice steady and sure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, as the city welcomed the new year. Inside, the quiet hum of hope and second chances filled the space. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For Nathaniel, Rachel, and Tommy, this was a new beginning, built not on promises of perfection, but on the resilience of love forgiveness, and the choice to stay. And as the last light of day faded into night, their hearts were full. As the snow continued to fall gently outside, Nathaniel, Rachel, and Tommy found themselves wrapped in the warmth of their shared journey, a story of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. Their story reminds us that life isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to face our mistakes, the strength to build something better, and the beauty of second chances. No matter how far we may feel from the people we care about, it's never too late to reconnect and choose love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little hope this season. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories filled with inspiration, kindness, and joy. Let us know in the comments, what does family mean to you? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Happy New Year!